The streets of New Alexandria hummed with a low, mechanical whine, a sound synonymous with the city's neon-lit chaos. Marcus Kane walked through the maze of alleys, his hood drawn low over his face. His boots hit the wet pavement with a steady rhythm, the echoes swallowed by the ambient noise of distant sirens and the occasional shout from the shadows. He moved with a deliberate calm, a man who had no reason to fear the city's darkness. The glow of Marcus's faintly visible tattoo on his neck, a twisting pattern of luminescent lines and shapes, seemed to pulse softly as if alive. He kept his head down, uninterested in the world around him. But the world was interested in him. A group of 6 men leaned against the wall ahead, their laughter coarse and loud. They were dressed in mismatched armor, their cybernetic implants glinting in the dim light. Their leader, a burly man with a jagged scar running across his cheek, noticed Marcus first. His augmented eye clicked and whirred as it scanned the approaching figure. "Well, what do we have here?" the leader said, stepping forward and spreading his arms mockingly. "Lost, are we?" Marcus didn't respond. He adjusted his hood slightly, exposing the lower part of his face, and kept walking. "Hey, I'm talking to you," the leader barked. His crew straightened, their movements almost synchronized. Cybernetic limbs hummed, weapons adjusted in their holsters, and cruel grins spread across their faces. Marcus stopped, his gaze lifting slightly. "I'm not looking for trouble," he said evenly, his voice low but carrying a weight that silenced the gang's laughter for a moment. "You hear that?" the leader said, turning to his men. "He's not looking for trouble." The gang erupted into laughter again, but there was an edge to it now, a mix of mockery and unease. One of the younger gang members, a wiry man with metallic fingers, stepped closer. "He doesn't look so tough, Drex. Bet he's hiding something under that hood." Drex, the leader, took a step forward, narrowing his cybernetic eye. "Show us your face, stranger. Let's see what you're hiding." Marcus sighed and reached up, pulling back his hood. His face was calm, almost serene, but the gang's attention was drawn immediately to the tattoo on his neck. The faint glow intensified for a brief second, the lines shifting as if responding to their scrutiny. "What's that?" another gang member asked, his voice uncertain. Drex waved him off. "Just a fancy light show. Probably paid for it to look tough." But there was something in Marcus's eyes that made Drex pause. They were steady, unblinking, and filled with a quiet intensity that unnerved even the hardened leader. "You should walk away," Marcus said, his tone calm but firm. Drex sneered. "You don't give the orders here." He motioned to his crew, who began to circle Marcus, their movements predatory. "Last chance," Marcus warned, his voice dropping. The gang closed in, their confidence bolstered by their numbers and enhancements. Marcus didn't move, his hands at his sides, his gaze fixed on Drex. The leader smirked and gave the signal. In an instant, the alley erupted into chaos. The first blow came from the wiry man with metallic fingers, a swift, calculated strike aimed at Marcus's head. Marcus sidestepped effortlessly, his movements fluid and precise, and the man stumbled past him, off balance. Before the gang could process what had happened, Marcus pivoted, catching the next assailant mid-charge with a perfectly timed palm strike to the chest. The force sent the attacker crashing into a stack of crates, groaning in pain. The others hesitated for a split second, startled by the speed and efficiency of Marcus's reactions. But Drex barked, "Don't just stand there. Take him down." The gang moved as a unit, cybernetic implants whirring to life. One came at Marcus with a blade extending from his mechanical forearm, the blade humming faintly with an electric charge. Marcus leaned back just enough to let the blade pass inches from his chest, then stepped forward and delivered a quick strike to the man's wrist. Sparks flew as the cybernetic limb short-circuited, and the blade fell uselessly to the ground. As the fight intensified, the tattoo on Marcus's neck began to glow more brightly, casting a faint blue light on his skin. Each movement he made seemed impossibly fast, his strikes deliberate and devastating. The gang, despite their enhancements, found themselves outmatched at every turn. "What the hell is he?" one of them muttered, clutching his dislocated shoulder. Drex watched, his expression shifting from confidence to unease. He had fought plenty of tough opponents, but this was something different. Marcus wasn't just skilled, he was operating on a level that seemed almost inhuman. And then there was that tattoo, now glowing steadily, its intricate patterns pulsing in sync with Marcus's movements. Drex stepped forward, drawing a large plasma baton from his side. Enough of this, he growled, activating the weapon. The baton crackled with energy, casting a harsh light that made the shadows in the alley dance. "You've had your fun," Drex said, his voice cold. "Now you're gonna bleed." Marcus stood still, his gaze fixed on Drex. The air around him seemed to shift subtly, an almost imperceptible hum filling the space. "You don't understand what you're dealing with," Marcus said quietly. Drex smirked and charged. Swinging the baton in a wide arc, Marcus didn't flinch. Instead, he raised his arm, and the tattoo flared with a blinding brilliance. A shimmering field of energy appeared around him, absorbing the blow from the baton effortlessly. The energy rippled outward, sending Drex stumbling back in shock. The gang froze, their confidence shattered. This wasn't a man. They were beginning to believe the rumors. The Harbinger, a figure of whispered legends, marked by an ancient symbol of unparalleled power. Marcus moved forward, his presence commanding. "This tattoo isn't just decoration," he said, his voice carrying a weight that made every word sink deep. "It's a symbol of what I was made to do, a reminder of what I left behind." Drex's hands trembled as he gripped the baton tighter. "You think you can scare us with stories?" He spat, but his voice wavered. "I don't need to scare you," Marcus replied. He took another step closer, and the light from his tattoo seemed to grow warmer, brighter. "But I'll give you the truth. I was part of something called Project Chimera, a program designed to create weapons out of men. They succeeded, but at a cost no one was prepared to pay." The gang exchanged nervous glances, their bravado unraveling. Drex tried to speak, but the words caught in his throat. "We were enhanced," Marcus continued, his tone steady but edged with pain. "Strength, speed, resilience, all beyond anything human. But the real change wasn't physical. They unlocked parts of us no one should touch, tied us to technology we barely understood. This tattoo," he gestured to the glowing mark. "It's a conduit, a link to something far older and far more dangerous than your cybernetics. It's not just power, it's a promise. And I keep my promises." One of the gang members, his voice trembling, muttered, "This can't be real. He's just trying to scare us." Marcus turned to him, his eyes locking onto the man's. "Do I look like someone who needs to bluff?" The man fell silent, his gaze dropping to the ground. Drex, desperate to reclaim control, lunged again, swinging the baton with all his strength. But Marcus didn't move to block. Instead, the energy around him expanded in an instant, forming a barrier that deflected the attack. The force of the impact sent Drex flying backward, landing hard on the ground. The rest of the gang didn't dare move. They watched in stunned silence as Marcus stepped forward, his tattoo still glowing with an eerie intensity. "You wanted a fight," Marcus said, his voice calm but firm. "You've got your answer. Now ask yourselves, is this a fight you want to continue?" Drex coughed, struggling to sit up. His cybernetic eye flickered, the systems overloaded from the energy blast. He looked at Marcus, his face pale. What are you?" Marcus stared down at him, his expression unreadable. "I'm what happens when humanity tries to play God. And I'm here to remind you that some lines shouldn't be crossed." The gang didn't argue. One by one, they backed away, their fear palpable. Drex remained on the ground, his eyes wide with a mixture of terror and awe. Marcus turned, his back to the gang, and walked away without another word. The tattoo's glow faded slowly, leaving the alley in darkness once more. Drex groaned as he tried to rise, his body trembling from the force of the blow. His cybernetic systems sputtered and sparked, the once confident gang leader now reduced to a shadow of himself. Marcus stood a few steps away, his back turned to the group, the faint glow of his tattoo pulsing softly in the darkness. For a moment, Silence filled the alley, broken only by the distant hum of the city. You had a choice, Marcus said, his voice calm but carrying a sharp edge. You could have walked away. You could have avoided all of this. He turned slowly to face them, his gaze sweeping over the remaining gang members. They flinched, their bravado utterly shattered. What are you going to do to us? One of them stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. Marcus tilted his head slightly, his expression unreadable. That depends on you, he said. You've seen what I can do. You've felt it. But this isn't about me. It's about you. Every action has consequences. The question is, are you ready to face yours? Drex struggled to his feet, his knees wobbling. His once defiant smirk was gone, replaced by a mixture of fear and desperation. You think you're better than us? He spat, though the trembling in his voice betrayed him. You think you're some kind of hero? Marcus's eyes locked onto Drex, and for a moment, the air seemed to grow heavier. A hero? He repeated, his tone laced with a quiet intensity. No, I'm no hero. I've done things that would make your worst nightmares seem like bedtime stories. I'm not here to save anyone. I'm here to make sure people like you understand there's a line you don't cross. Drex clenched his fists, his cybernetic hand twitching involuntarily. You don't know anything about us, he said, his voice rising. You think you can just walk in here, beat us down, and preach to us? Marcus stepped closer, his movements slow and deliberate. The glow of his tattoo intensified, casting a faint blue light over the alley. You think this is about preaching? He asked, his voice low and measured. This is about accountability. You've spent your life taking what you want, hurting whoever gets in your way. But tonight you've hit a wall. You've met someone who won't bend to your threats, who won't flinch at your violence. And you don't know how to handle it. The gang members exchanged uneasy glances, their leader's defiance crumbling before their eyes. Drex opened his mouth to retort, but Marcus raised a hand, silencing him. I'm not here to destroy you, Marcus said. I could. You know that now. But what would that prove? What would that change? If I walk away and leave you broken in this alley, what lesson will you learn? None. He took another step forward, towering over Drex, who looked up at him with a mixture of rage and fear. So here's what's going to happen, Marcus continued. You're going to leave this place. You're going to look at the people you've hurt, the lives you've ruined, and you're going to decide if that's the man you want to be. Because if it is, if you keep walking this path. The tattoo on his neck flared, a brilliant blue light that bathed Drex and his gang in its glow. The air seemed to hum with an otherworldly energy, the sound reverberating deep in their chests. Then I'll find you again, Marcus finished. His voice was calm, but the weight of his words hit like a thunderclap. And next time, I won't be so merciful. The gang stood frozen, the full weight of Marcus's presence pressing down on them. Drex swallowed hard, his bravado completely gone. We'll go, he said quietly, his voice barely audible. We'll leave. Marcus nodded once, the glow of his tattoo dimming as he stepped back. Good, he said simply. Now get out of here. The gang didn't need to be told twice. They scrambled to their feet, helping Drex as they retreated down the alley. None of them dared look back, their footsteps echoing in the distance as they disappeared into the shadows. Marcus watched them go, his expression unreadable. He took a deep breath, letting the tension in his body release as the tattoo on his neck faded completely. He stood alone in the alley, the faint sounds of the city returning to fill the silence. He glanced down at his hands, flexing his fingers slowly. The power he held, the control he had fought so hard to maintain, it was a constant reminder of the responsibility he bore. He hadn't chosen this path, but it was his all the same. And tonight he had made his point. Turning away from the alley, Marcus walked toward the distant lights of the city, his footsteps steady and purposeful. There were more like them out there. More people who needed to understand what it meant to face the consequences of their actions. And as long as he drew breath, he would be there to remind them. Marcus walked through the city streets, his pace unhurried but deliberate. The distant glow of skyscrapers reflected in his eyes, but his mind was elsewhere. The confrontation in the alley lingered in his thoughts, not because of the danger he'd faced far worse, but because of what it represented. The same cycle, repeated over and over, like a wound humanity refused to let heal. He stopped at a rooftop garden, a rare pocket of calm in the sprawling chaos of New Alexandria. The city stretched out below him, a shimmering sea of lights and shadows. He leaned against the railing, staring at the horizon. The tattoo on his neck, now dormant, felt heavier than ever. Memories flooded his mind unbidden. Project Chimera, the endless training, the missions that pushed him beyond the limits of human endurance. They'd made him into a weapon, but they hadn't counted on him reclaiming his humanity. The tattoo, a mark of their ownership, had become something more to him. It wasn't just a symbol of what he'd been forced to endure. It was a reminder of the line he refused to cross. He thought of Drex and his gang, the fear in their eyes when they realized what they were up against. For a moment, he'd felt the old pull, the temptation to let his power loose, to show them just how small they truly were. But he'd held back. Power without restraint was destruction, and destruction without purpose was chaos. Marcus exhaled slowly, the weight of his choices settling in his chest. He knew his actions tonight had sent a message, but it was a temporary victory at best. People like Drex were symptoms of a deeper sickness, a rot that had festered in humanity for centuries. Prejudice, greed, the need to dominate. These weren't problems that could be solved with fists or energy shields. His hand drifted to the tattoo, tracing the intricate patterns with his fingertips. It wasn't just a mark. It was a question, etched into his skin and his soul. What does it mean to be human? To possess such immense potential for both creation and destruction? The answer wasn't simple. It never had been. But Marcus knew one thing for certain. Humanity's strength lay not in its weapons or technology, but in its capacity to change, to grow, to rise above the worst parts of itself and become something better. The faint sound of footsteps drew his attention. He turned, his body instinctively tense. But the figure that emerged from the shadows was no threat. A young boy, no older than 10, stood at the edge of the garden, clutching a small, tattered bag. His clothes were worn, his face smudged with dirt, but his eyes were bright with curiosity. "You're him, aren't you?" the boy asked, his voice trembling slightly. Marcus frowned. "Him? The one they talk about," the boy said. "The Harbinger. The one who stands up to the bad people." Marcus studied the boy, his expression softening. "I'm just a man," he said quietly. "Nothing more." The boy took a hesitant step forward. "But you help people, right? You stop the ones who hurt others." Marcus nodded slowly. "When I can." The boy reached into his bag and pulled out a small, hand-carved figure. It was crude, the wood splintered in places, but it was unmistakably meant to represent a hero. "My dad made this," the boy said. "He said people like you give us hope." Marcus felt a lump form in his throat. He crouched down, meeting the boy's gaze. "Your dad sounds like a wise man," he said. The boy nodded. "He said no matter how bad things get, there's always someone out there fighting for what's right." Marcus took the figure, turning it over in his hands. It was simple, imperfect, but it carried a weight that was hard to describe. He handed it back to the boy. "Keep this," he said. "And remember, hope doesn't come from people like me. It comes from people like you. From everyone who chooses to believe things can be better." The boy smiled, a small but genuine expression that warmed something deep inside Marcus. He watched as the boy turned and disappeared back into the shadows, his footsteps light and quick. As the city's hum filled the silence once more, Marcus stood and looked out at the horizon again. The fight wasn't over, not by a long shot. But tonight he'd made a difference. And maybe, just maybe, that difference would ripple outward, touching lives in ways he couldn't predict. He pulled his hood back up and turned away from the railing, his silhouette blending into the darkness. The tattoo on his neck pulsed faintly, a steady rhythm like a heartbeat. It wasn't just a mark of his past. It was a beacon, a reminder that even in the darkest times, light could still shine. As Marcus disappeared into the night, the city continued its ceaseless rhythm. But somewhere, in a small, quiet corner, hope had taken root. And for now, that was enough. The dim glow of dawn began to creep over the horizon, casting a pale light on the city's steel and glass towers. Marcus moved through the quiet streets, his presence unnoticed in the early morning stillness. His mind churned with thoughts, not of the confrontation, but of what lay ahead. Each step he took felt heavier, burdened by the weight of the choices he'd made and those he knew were still to come. He passed a boarded-up storefront, its broken windows reflecting fragmented pieces of his silhouette. Pausing briefly, he looked at his reflection, studying the man he'd become. The tattoo on his neck remained dim, its glow barely perceptible in the muted light. It was a reminder, always there, always waiting. The streets began to stir as the city woke, people emerging from their homes and shelters to start another day. Most avoided Marcus's gaze, their faces downcast, their movements hurried. He could see it in their eyes, the fear, the exhaustion, the weight of simply surviving in a world that seemed to demand everything and give so little in return. A woman passed by, clutching a child to her chest. Her eyes flicked to Marcus for a moment, wide with caution, before she hurried on. Marcus's gaze followed her, his thoughts lingering on the fragility of it all. For every Drex, there were a dozen like her, just trying to make it through another day. He found himself drawn to a small park tucked between two towering buildings, its trees sparse and struggling but still standing. The faint sound of laughter reached his ears, a group of children playing with a makeshift ball, their joy untainted by the harshness of the world around them. It was a rare and fleeting moment, but it reminded Marcus of something he hadn't felt in a long time: hope. He sat on a worn bench, his shoulders slumping slightly as he let the tension drain from his body. The events of the previous night replayed in his mind, each strike, each word, each decision. He'd seen the fear in Drex's eyes, the dawning realization that he was up against something far beyond his understanding. But fear wasn't enough. Fear was temporary. Marcus knew that change couldn't come from intimidation alone. It required something deeper, something harder to achieve. Conviction, will, the belief that a better way was possible. A shadow fell across him, and he looked up to see an older man standing nearby, his face lined with years of hardship but his eyes sharp and discerning. "Mind if I sit?" the man asked, his voice gravelly but kind. Marcus gestured to the empty space beside him. The man lowered himself onto the bench, letting out a small grunt as his joints protested. They sat in silence for a moment, the sounds of the city gradually rising around them. "You don't see many like you around here," the man said finally, his gaze fixed on the children in the park. "Like me?" Marcus asked, his tone neutral. "Someone who carries the weight," the man replied. He tapped his temple. "You can see it in the eyes. Like you're fighting a war no one else can see." Marcus didn't respond immediately. "Everyone's fighting something," he said eventually. The man nodded. "True enough. But some fights aren't meant to be fought alone." Marcus turned to look at him, his expression unreadable. "And what if it has to be?" The man chuckled softly, a dry, raspy sound. "No fight has to be. That's just something we tell ourselves when we're too stubborn to let others in." Marcus considered this, his mind flicking back to the faces he'd encountered. The boy in the garden, the woman clutching her child, the gang in the alley. Each had their own struggles, their own battles. He'd stepped into their lives for a moment. But was that enough? Could it ever be? "You've got power," the man said, his voice drawing Marcus back to the present. "I can see it, feel it, but power's just a tool. What matters is how you use it." Marcus looked down at his hands, the faint glow of the tattoo barely visible beneath the morning light. "And if using it makes things worse?" The man shrugged. "Then you learn and you do better. No one gets it right all the time. What matters is that you try." They sat in silence again, the weight of the conversation settling between them. Finally, the man stood, his movements slow but deliberate. He placed a hand on Marcus's shoulder, a brief but grounding gesture. "Whatever it is you're carrying," he said, "don't let it crush you. The world needs people like you, whether it knows it or not." With that, the man walked away, leaving Marcus alone on the bench. He watched the man disappear into the crowd, his words lingering like an echo in Marcus's mind. For a long time, Marcus sat there, his thoughts churning. The tattoo on his neck began to pulse faintly, a steady rhythm like a heartbeat. He didn't have all the answers. He doubted he ever would. But as he watched the children in the park, their laughter rising above the noise of the city, he felt a flicker of something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. Purpose. He stood, his movements slow but deliberate, and pulled his hood back up. The city stretched out before him, a labyrinth of chaos and pain but also resilience and hope. He didn't know what his next step would be, but he knew he couldn't stop. There were more battles to fight, more lives to touch, more lines to defend. And as long as he carried the mark, he would keep moving forward. For himself, for the people he'd saved, and for those he hadn't yet met. With renewed determination, Marcus disappeared into the bustling streets, the faint glow of his tattoo the only trace he left behind. The city hummed with life as the day unfolded, its pulse a steady rhythm of voices, footsteps, and machines. Marcus moved among the crowd, his presence a shadow that blended seamlessly into the chaos. To those around him, he was just another face, another body navigating the endless churn of New Alexandria. But beneath the surface, he was a storm contained, a force held back by sheer will. His steps led him toward the industrial sector, a place where the city's facade of progress gave way to its underbelly. The air grew heavier, tainted by the acrid stench of machinery and decay. The buildings here were older, their exteriors worn and stained by time. It was a stark contrast to the gleaming skyscrapers of the city center, a reminder of the disparity that defined this world. As he passed through the narrow streets, he caught snippets of conversation from the workers and residents. Their voices carried stories of struggle and endurance, of systems that seemed designed to keep them down. Marcus listened without interrupting, absorbing their words like fuel for the fire that burned within him. He stopped at an open-air market, its stalls lined with goods both mundane and illicit. Vendors called out to potential customers, their voices a mix of desperation and determination. Marcus's eyes scanned the crowd, noting the faces etched with weariness, the subtle exchanges that spoke of deals made in the shadows. A small commotion caught his attention. A man berating a young vendor, his voice sharp and cutting. The vendor, a girl barely out of her teens, stood frozen, her hands trembling as she clutched a handful of credits. The man loomed over her, his anger spilling out in accusations and threats. Marcus moved closer, his footsteps silent on the cracked pavement. He didn't need to raise his voice to make his presence known. The man turned, his expression shifting from anger to wariness as he met Marcus's gaze. "Problem here?" Marcus asked, his tone calm but firm. The man hesitated, his bravado faltering. "This has nothing to do with you," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. Marcus's eyes flicked to the girl, who still clutched the credits as if they were her lifeline. "Looks like you're trying to take what isn't yours," he said, his gaze returning to the man. "That's my business." The man took a step back, his confidence evaporating under the weight of Marcus's presence. "Fine," he muttered. "Not worth the trouble." He turned and disappeared into the crowd, leaving the girl standing there, her relief palpable. Marcus crouched down, meeting her gaze. "You all right?" he asked. She nodded quickly, her eyes wide with gratitude. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Be careful," Marcus said. "People like him prey on those they think are weak. Don't give them a reason to think that about you." The girl nodded again, clutching her credits tightly as she hurried away. Marcus watched her go, his expression unreadable. He knew her story wasn't unique. It was one of thousands, each a thread in the larger tapestry of inequality and exploitation that defined this city. As he turned to leave the market, his mind drifted to the tattoo on his neck. It wasn't glowing, but he felt its presence like a brand, a reminder of his purpose. He hadn't chosen this path, but it was his now, and every step he took was a step toward making a difference, however small. He moved deeper into the industrial sector, the noise growing louder as machines roared to life and workers shouted to be heard. The air was thick with smoke and heat, the environment oppressive but alive with energy. Marcus could feel the weight of the place, the sense of purpose mixed with desperation. A group of workers stood near a massive assembly line, their conversation heated. Marcus slowed his pace, listening as they argued about wages, safety, and the ever-present threat of layoffs. Their frustration was palpable, their voices filled with anger and fear. He didn't intervene, knowing his presence would only disrupt the fragile balance of their dynamic. Instead, he observed, filing their words away as pieces of a larger puzzle. The problems they faced were systemic, deeply ingrained in the fabric of their lives. And while Marcus could stop a mugger or disarm a gang, these issues required more than his fists or his power. As he left the industrial sector, his mind churned with thoughts of what he could do, what he should do. He wasn't naive enough to think he could fix everything, but he couldn't ignore the voices of those who struggled to be heard. The city stretched out before him, a labyrinth of challenges and opportunities. Marcus knew his role wasn't to solve every problem or fight every battle. But he also knew that his presence, his actions, could spark something in others, a sense of possibility, a belief that change was within reach. He walked on, the faint glow of his tattoo hidden beneath his hood. The day was far from over, and the road ahead was long. But Marcus had learned to take it one step at a time, one moment at a time. And as long as he carried the mark, he would keep moving forward. Marcus found himself on the edge of the city, where the towering buildings gave way to the desolate remnants of what once was. The outskirts were a stark contrast to the controlled chaos of New Alexandria's heart. Here, life clung to survival in the cracks, like stubborn weeds breaking through concrete. The air was quieter but heavier, weighted by the stories of those left behind. He walked along a dirt path lined with makeshift shelters, their walls pieced together from scrap metal and tarpaulins. Eyes followed him as he passed, wary but curious. Marcus was used to the scrutiny. His presence carried an aura that couldn't be ignored. He didn't slow his pace, but he didn't rush either. These were the people who had been cast aside, forgotten by the systems that claimed to serve them. A group of children played near a rusted-out vehicle, their laughter a rare sound in the somber surroundings. They paused when they saw Marcus, their games forgotten as they stared at him with wide eyes. He offered them a small nod before continuing, their curiosity trailing after him like a shadow. Further along, an older woman sat by a fire, her hands busy weaving strips of cloth into what looked like a crude blanket. She didn't look up as Marcus approached, but her voice reached him before he could pass. "Not many come here unless they're looking for something." Marcus stopped, her words hanging in the air between them. "Maybe I'm just passing through," he replied. She let out a dry chuckle, finally lifting her gaze to meet his. Her eyes were sharp, full of a wisdom that came from surviving too long in a world that didn't care. "No one just passes through here. You either need something or you're running from something." Marcus considered her words, then crouched down to meet her at eye level. What if it's both? She studied him for a long moment, her hands never pausing in their work. "Then you're in the right place. People come here to find what they've lost, even if they don't realize it." Marcus tilted his head slightly. "And what have you lost?" Her hands paused for the first time, her expression softening. "Too much to name. But I'm still here, and that has to count for something." Marcus nodded, standing again. "It does," he said simply, and continued on his way. The path led him to the edge of a ravine, where the ground fell away into a jagged expanse of rock and rubble. Beyond it, the city loomed in the distance, its lights a stark reminder of the divide between the center and the edges. Marcus stood there for a long time, the wind tugging at his hood, his thoughts as restless as the shifting clouds above. He thought about the old woman's words, about the people he'd seen and the lives they lived. Their struggles were different from the ones he faced, but no less valid. He'd spent so much time fighting battles that were loud and immediate, brawls in dark alleys, confrontations that left bruises and scars. But the battles here were quieter, more insidious. They didn't leave marks on the skin. They carved themselves into the soul. Marcus reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, worn token. It was nothing special. A smooth piece of metal etched with a simple design. It had been given to him years ago by someone he couldn't remember clearly, but the gesture had stuck with him. A reminder that even the smallest acts of kindness could leave an imprint. He turned the token over in his fingers, the cool metal grounding him. Then, with a flick of his wrist, he tossed it into the ravine, watching as it disappeared into the shadows below. It wasn't a loss. It was a letting go, a way to make space for something new. As he stood there, a voice called out behind him, hesitant but determined. He turned to see a young man, no older than 20, standing a few paces away. His clothes were tattered, his face thin and hollowed, but his eyes burned with a quiet intensity. "You're him, aren't you?" the young man asked. Marcus didn't answer immediately. "Who do you think I am?" "The one who stops them," the young man said. "The gangs, the enforcers, anyone who thinks they can take what they want without consequence." Marcus crossed his arms, studying him. "And what if I am?" The young man stepped closer, his voice lowering. "Then I need your help. My sister, she's been taken. They're holding her in the old factory near the ridge." Marcus's gaze hardened. "Who's holding her?" "Drex's crew," the young man said, his voice trembling slightly. "They're demanding a ransom, but we don't have anything left to give." The name struck a chord, a reminder of the previous night's encounter. Marcus had warned Drex, but it seemed the man hadn't learned his lesson. "Take me there," Marcus said, his voice firm. The young man hesitated, then nodded, leading the way back toward the heart of the outskirts. Marcus followed, his steps steady and his mind sharp. He didn't know what he would find at the factory, but he knew one thing for certain. The fight wasn't over. And as long as there were people who needed him, it never would be. The air around the abandoned factory was thick with tension, its looming structure a silent witness to years of decay and misuse. Marcus followed the young man closely, his senses on high alert. The faint hum of machinery could be heard from within, a reminder that the factory wasn't entirely lifeless. The young man stopped abruptly, pointing to a side entrance obscured by rusted metal and overgrown weeds. "They're in there," he whispered. "There's usually a couple of guards outside, but I don't know how many are inside." Marcus nodded, his expression unreadable. "Stay here. I'll handle it." The young man hesitated, fear and hope warring in his eyes, but he obeyed. Marcus approached the factory with silent precision, his footsteps muffled by the dirt and debris. He didn't need to see the guards to know they were there. Their muffled voices carried on the wind, laced with the casual arrogance of men who believed themselves untouchable. He rounded the corner and saw them. Two men leaning against the wall, their postures relaxed but their weapons within reach. Marcus stepped into their line of sight, his presence an immediate disruptor. The men straightened, their hands moving toward their weapons, but Marcus was faster. A swift, calculated movement disarmed the first man, his weapon clattering to the ground. The second barely had time to react before Marcus closed the distance, a well-placed strike rendering him unconscious. The entire encounter lasted less than 10 seconds. The guards crumpled to the ground in silence. Marcus stepped over them, entering the factory through the side door. The interior was a maze of rusted machinery and crumbling walls, the air heavy with the scent of oil and mildew. He moved through the shadows, his footsteps purposeful but quiet. Voices echoed from deeper within, guiding him to a large open space where Drex and his crew had gathered. They were lounging around, their confidence palpable. A girl sat on the floor nearby, her hands bound, her face pale but defiant. She couldn't have been more than 16, her small frame dwarfed by the menacing figures around her. Drex stood at the center, his posture relaxed but his eyes sharp. He was speaking, his voice carrying a tone of mockery as he addressed the girl. "Your brother thinks he can outsmart us? Let him try. We'll see how far his courage gets him when he has nothing left to lose." Marcus stepped into the light, his presence cutting through the tension like a blade. The room fell silent as all eyes turned to him. Drex's expression shifted from amusement to recognition, then to anger. You again, Drex snarled. Didn't you get the message last time? Marcus didn't respond. Instead, he took a step closer, his gaze unwavering. The tattoo on his neck began to glow faintly, its light pulsing in time with his steady heartbeat. Drex's crew exchanged uneasy glances, the memory of their last encounter fresh in their minds. You think you can just walk in here and take what you want? Drex continued, his voice rising. This is my territory. My rules. Marcus's voice was calm but laced with steel. Your rules end where people suffer for your greed. Drex laughed. A harsh, brittle sound. You think you're some kind of savior? You're just one man. Sometimes one man is enough, Marcus replied. The room exploded into motion as Drex's crew moved to attack. Marcus met them head-on, his movements a blur of precision and power. Each strike was deliberate, each motion calculated. The glow of his tattoo intensified, casting an eerie light that only heightened the chaos. Drex hung back, watching as his men fell one by one. The fear in his eyes grew with each passing second, his bravado crumbling under the weight of Marcus's presence. Finally, he turned to run, but Marcus was faster. He caught Drex by the collar, slamming him against a nearby pillar. The man's breath hitched, his defiance replaced by pure terror. Enough, Marcus said, his voice low but commanding. You think fear makes you powerful? It doesn't. It makes you weak. Drex didn't respond, his eyes wide with panic. Marcus released him, letting him fall to the ground in a heap. If I ever hear of you hurting anyone again, Marcus said, his tone ice-cold, you won't get a second chance. Drex scrambled to his feet, nodding frantically before fleeing into the shadows. Marcus turned his attention to the girl, kneeling to untie her bonds. Her hands trembled as she rubbed her wrists, but her eyes were steady. Your brother's outside, Marcus said. Let's get you back to him. She nodded, her voice too choked with emotion to respond. Marcus led her out of the factory, the young man waiting anxiously by the entrance. The siblings embraced tightly, their relief palpable. Thank you, the young man said, his voice thick with gratitude. Marcus nodded, his expression softening slightly. Take care of each other, he said before turning to leave. As he walked away, the glow of his tattoo began to fade, its light dimming until it was barely visible. The city awaited him, its challenges endless, its people in need. But Marcus didn't falter. His steps were steady, his resolve unshaken. He didn't need recognition or thanks. The mark on his neck was enough, a constant reminder of who he was and what he stood for. He disappeared into the shadows, leaving behind only the faintest trace of his presence. But for those whose lives he touched, his impact would last far longer than the glow of a tattoo ever could.